Take a seat.
And here in Singapore, you begin to see a very interesting experiment going on with Razor TV, where you actually find now, although this is all internet TV in a way, but how do you take the broadcast of the TV and now start to merge it with user-generated content at the same time? So you now have kind of this phenomenon over here that says, I'm going to kind of push something out, but the users can now start to kind of comment in real time on this type of channel. And you get a very interesting kind of folding of kind of the co-creation along with the mass form of the production. But let's look at Media 2.0, which I think is the thing that I find going to be most startling. And by Media 2.0, I'm going to talk about the very simple idea, but it gets kind of complicated to really be able to pull this off, is what happens when the physical world and the virtual worlds start to interpenetrate each other. And in fact, what you might say is, what does it mean to say, could it be the case that we'll actually reach a stage where the physical and the virtual so deeply commingle that they have converged? What is the media going to be like in a world in which basically the physical and the virtual now are so interpenetrated with each other that you kind of get the best properties, of both? But how do you start down this path, and why does this turn out to be kind of interesting? I think kind of one of the simplest examples is, for example, take the iPhone. Why has the iPhone turned out to be so startlingly successful? Well, one, going back to the Amazon Kindle, of course, this is a beautiful end-to-end experience because this device is connected to iTunes in a very interesting way and so on and so forth, and from there to the artists. But as a device, this device already has, a couple of accelerometers built into it. And as a set of accelerometers built into it, basically it can tell certain things like, for example, what angle it is and so on and so forth. We've only begun to see the beginnings of what could actually happen here. Because obviously if you have a couple of accelerometers in here, you can start to use this as a gestural device. It's a little bit curious why you still think you need a keyboard if you can do gestures the right way, or even scribbles and so on and so forth. You can do a tremendous amount just starting there. But also look at kind of the other types of gestures in terms of what you can do with your fingers on this thing in terms of how you expand and contract. Now, I don't know how many of you kind of live on the iPhone, but it is startling to me how much serious reading I can already do on this iPhone. And just kind of learning new types of reading practices again, and how you modulate things with your fingers in terms of how do you move stuff around, how do you expand, how do you push that part that's been expanded, and so on and so forth around through the screen. So you're beginning already to get, in a very simple sense, a merger of some aspects of the physical with the virtual in this phone. Talk about a game changer. Some of us who are kind of architectural geeks, believed that the Sony cell, the chip inside their new PS3, was going to be a blockbuster idea because that cell is a fairly interesting piece of architecture. But look what happened. It was actually the Wii that ended up changing the game. Why did Wii change the game? Very much like iPhone, is that basically I could now have a complete new kind of user experience where I could start to be able to move the Wii around. I could even practice my golf, tennis, whatever you want, because all of a sudden now, basically I could start to interact with this device as a physical device, and it was being kind of mapped into the virtual device in a way that I could now interact with the game space in a completely new sort of way. Now, that's just the beginning. I mean, I was very intrigued some time ago, and you have actually a fair amount of presence right now in Singapore in Second Life. And this whole notion that, for example, here is the book release party by Cory Doctorow in his recent book. And what is really interesting is, of course, avatars came from all over the world. And if you actually are in Second Life, I have to say that there is something very curious about sitting next to an avatar who you can actually whisper with, IM with, voice over IP with, et cetera, et cetera. So suddenly now you begin to have this virtual world that starts to have some of the properties of the physical world. But as you know, this is barely scratching the surface. I mean, the new kind of generations of Second Life have this property that maybe they can, with motion capture techniques, et cetera, I can start to kind of have something watching me or sensing what I'm doing and having that directly reflected in the avatars. So basically, my physical presence in the physical space is now isomorphically mirrored into the virtual space. And so now I can have, several of us can actually feel a tremendous sense of physical presence, head motions, and so on and so forth, and yet be able to bring these together anywhere you want in terms of the virtuality. That's just the kind of the beginning. I was very interested in exploring new forms at the Institute for Multimedia Literacy at USC, picking up some of Tufte's book, kind of mapping that into a kind of a tunnel that you kind of move through and start to be able to interact with. In this particular type device, you can kind of read all this, but more importantly, as a physical space, you can start to leave notes on these things. Other people can pick up those notes, add to those notes, and so on and so forth. And so it's kind of a physical experience that you're kind of locating yourself in, as well as kind of a commentary space where this physical experience helps to locate the kind of comments that you want to make. And even here, which is kind of, it seems a little bit artificial, you begin to see that kind of reading and interacting ends up being actually quite different. But let's go one step further and look at Ken Ward's recent stuff called the game theory, following from his kind of hacker theory. And this was a very interesting experiment in terms of how to write a book, with in public, so to speak, that we could kind of critique with him, every one of his flashcards that he was using to organize the book with, and so on and so forth. But I want to kind of go the next step, because this is a very simple example, again, of a new type of convergence, more of the kind of media 2.0 I was talking about. I want to look at an interview that was done with him inside Halo as a game space. And what does this start to suggest of new ways to kind of be able to kind of capture very kind of entrancing types of behavior? And I think with some amount of luck, we'll be able to fire this up. We have lost the voice. Which is too bad. So let me move on. I don't know, we had the voice a moment ago. We have a voice track and a music track put together on this one. But it's kind of like a TV show where a very interesting interview actually goes on and a lot of interesting stuff comes out, but it's all done on machinima. It's all done inside the game space. And it makes it incredibly easy for us as amateurs or whatever to construct kind of our own movies or our own TV show or our own interviews, inside this type of space. And I can see that it's going to be an interesting question tonight. What happened to that audio stream? I won't debug it at the moment. So let me move on. Because I said that what I was so intrigued with is these are just little smattering examples of, you might call this, beginning type of interpenetration between the physical and the virtual. And a couple of weeks ago at IDM, Michael Yep's operation, there was a kind of a contest of people that were presenting proposals for next year. And looking at these things and looking at kind of the companies that have already been started, in fact, Razor TV was one of them that are happening here. It's been very interesting to begin to see how a kind of a whole new type of kind of ecosystem is beginning to be developed that really starts to show that, to experiment with how this kind of convergence 2.0 may actually play out in all different kinds of the industry around here. In fact, there's a lot of kind of discussion in terms of both how this may affect healthcare, obviously education, and so on. So I think that several of us were extremely kind of delighted at the degree of vision and inspiration and entrepreneurial spirits that we saw kind of in these proposals this year. And it's been, from my point of view, a very interesting change just in 1 year, the quality of the proposals, the kind of proposals that we actually saw, really happening here. So let me kind of start down the closing path here, and then we can open this all up to say, kind of what is the bigger picture that we may be getting at here. I think one is, and for those more from the academy as well, there's a certain sense I find of kind of literacy in flux. Let's look at this from 2 points of view. One says, literacy requires an ability to work with the borders between tradition and change, the ability to adapt, improvise, and amalgamate. That, I think, gets at something very important, followed on by, not as a monolithic term, but as a cloud of sometimes contradictory nexus points among different positions. Literacy can be seen not as a skill, but a process of situating and resituating representations in social space. Begin to get a sense of how this game is beginning to shift from this notion that it's not a skill, but this process of resituating representations in different types of social spaces, which ties us back to the kind of all the stuff happening in social media as well.
Take a seat.